The Ecuadorian-Peruvian War, also known as the War of 41, was a border war fought from 5 to 31 July 1941. It was the first of three military conflicts that occurred between the two nations during the 20th century. During the war, Peru occupied the western Ecuadorian province of El Oro and parts of the Andean province of Loya. Although the Ecuadorian-Peruvian War occurred during World War II, it was not part of the conflict, and Ecuador and Peru were neither affiliated to the Allies or Axis nor supported by either side. A ceasefire agreement between the two countries went into effect on the 31st of July 1941. Both countries signed the Rio Protocol on the 29th of January 1942, and Peruvian forces subsequently withdrew. The enmity over the territorial dispute continued after 1942 and concluded following the Cenepa War of 1995 and the signing of the Brasilia Presidential Act Agreement in October 1998. History. Background. The dispute between Ecuador and Peru dates from 1840. It revolved around whether Ecuador's territory extended beyond the Andes mountain range to the Marañón River, including the Amazonian basin. As early as 1829, Peru fought against the Gran Colombia, of which the disputed lands were a part. After a series of battles, the war ended in what is known as the Battle of Tarqui. The Guadalajara Treaty was signed on September 22, 1829, ending the war. This treaty, better known as the Treaty of Guayaquil, specified that the Gran Colombian-Peruvian border was to be the same border that had existed between the Spanish colonial viceroyalties of Nueva Granada and Lima. Subsequently, Ecuador contended that the Pedemonte-Mosquera Protocol was signed in 1830 as a continuation of the Guadalajara Treaty. Peru disputes the validity of this and even questions its existence, since the original document cannot be found. Furthermore, Peru argues that the treaties signed with the Gran Colombia were rendered void upon the dissolution of that federation. During 1859 and 1860, the two countries fought over disputed territory bordering the Amazon. However, Ecuador was in a civil war that prevented diplomatic relations with the rest of Latin America, including Peruvian President Ramón Castilla. In 1887, a treaty signed by both nations established that the King of Spain would act as an arbitrator. The resulting Herrera-Garcia Treaty was expected to resolve the conflict permanently. However, the Parliament of Peru would only ratify the treaty after introducing modifications. Ecuador then withdrew from the process in protest of the Peruvian modifications, and the king abstained from issuing a decision. Salomon-Lozano Treaty. Another dispute was created after the signing of the Salomon-Lozano Treaty in March 1922 by the governments of Colombia and Peru, which at the time was ruled by Augusto B. Legua. The treaty, which was kept secret, set the boundary between Peru and Colombia to be the Putumayo River, with the exception of a small strip of land controlled by the city of Leticia that would connect Colombia to the main flow of the Amazon River. Along with that, Colombia effectively recognized Peruvian control of the rest of the disputed region south of the Putumayo River. Following the coup d'état of Legua by the troops under the command of Luis Miguel Sánchez Cerro, the treaty was made public and caused much anger to the Peruvian population, which deemed that the treaty awarded Colombia a section of Peruvian territory. This dispute over the Amazon region controlled by the city of Leticia would eventually cause a short war between Colombia and Peru between 1932 and 1933. The conflict over Leticia, which was populated by both Peruvian and Colombian colonists, was resolved after Sanchez Cerro was assassinated and the new Peruvian president Oscar R. Benavides accepted the Rio de Janeiro Protocol, which upheld the Salomon-Lozano Treaty and finally put an end to the border disputes between Colombia and Peru. The Salomon-Lozano Treaty was unpopular in Ecuador as well, which found itself surrounded on the east by Peru, which claimed the territory as an integral part of its republic, further adding to Ecuador's problems. Now, Colombian authorities also recognized Peru's territorial aspirations as legitimate. Preparing for war, an agreement was signed in 1936 which recognized territories in de facto possession by each country. The resulting border is known as the 1936 status quo borderline. However, by 1938 both nations were once again holding minor border skirmishes. That same year, the entire Ecuadorian cabinet, which was composed of high-ranking army officers who served as advisors for General Alberto Enriquez Gallo, resigned from government in order to take command of the Ecuadorian army. Meanwhile, in Quito, there were public demonstrations of people chanting, "Down with Peru! Long live Ecuador!" Peru's response to the events taking place in Ecuador was provided by Foreign Minister Carlos Conca, who stated, "In Peru we have not yet lost our heads. Our country is in a process of prosperous development and the government heads would have to be completely mad to think of war." The social situation of Peru at the time was undergoing major changes, with the social reforms begun by President Augusto B. Leguía being continued by President General Oscar Benavides. Economically, Peru claimed to be attempting to run on a balanced budget, but Peru still held a large debt despite its positive foreign trade. However, despite these claims, Peru also began to mobilize its troops to its border with Ecuador in order to match the Ecuadorian troops which had been deployed to the dispute zone. On January 11, 1941, alleging that the Ecuadorians had been staging incursions and even occupations of the Peruvian territory of Zaramia, the president of Peru, Manuel Prado, ordered the formation of the North Grouping, a military unit in charge of the Northern Operational Theater. Forces involved Ecuador. According to the testimony of Col. Luis Rodriguez, the Ecuadorian forces at the disposal of the Army Border Command in El Oro after the incidents of July 5 and 6 were as follows. Forces deployed along the Zaramia River, 3 superior officers, 33 officers, and 743 men, organized as follows: Cayambe Battalion, 2 superior officers, 22 officers, 490 soldiers. Montecristi Battalion, 1 superior officer, 11 officers, 253 soldiers. Forces deployed in the immediate rear, 4 superior officers, 40 officers, 28 soldiers, 93 volunteers, 500 carabineros, organized as follows: at Arenales, 2 superior officers, 3 officers, 14 soldiers. At Santa Rosa, 2 superior officers, 1 officer, 18 soldiers, plus the 93 volunteers, and the 500 carabineros. Peru. As a result of the rising tensions on the border during 1939 and 1940, the Peruvian President Manuel Prado authorized in December 1940 the creation of the Agrupamiento del Norte. By July 1941, this unit was ready to begin active military operations. Peruvian Order of Battle, Agrupamiento del Norte, July 1941. Group Headquarters 5th and 7th Cavalry Regiments, 6th Artillery Group, Army Tank Detachment, 1st Light Infantry Division 1st, 5th, 19th Infantry Battalions 1st Artillery Group 1st Engineer Company, 1st Anti-Aircraft Section, 8th Light Infantry Division 20th Infantry Battalion 8th Artillery Group 8th Engineer Company, Army Detachment Chinchipe 33rd Infantry Battalion, Army Jungle Division. Figures for total strength of the Agrupamiento del Norte at the beginning of offensive operations have been put at 11,500 to 13,000 men. The accounts as to which side fired the first shot vary considerably to this day. According to Peru's version, Ecuadorian troops invaded Peruvian territory in the Zaramilla province, which started a battle that spread to a zone known as Quebrada Seca. But Ecuador's version is that Peru took a series of incidents between border patrols as a pretext to invade Ecuador, with the intention of forcing it to sign a clear border agreement. They argue that the clear disparity of military presence in the region between the two countries supports this version. The first clashes occurred on Saturday, July 5, 1941. According to Peruvian accounts, some Ecuadorian troops from the garrison of Huaquiles, a town on the bank of the Zaramilla River, which then served as the status quo line in the extreme left of the Ecuadorian-Peruvian border, crossed into the Peruvian border post at Aguas Verdes, a town directly in front of Huaquiles, and opened fire on a Peruvian patrol. These troops were then followed by some 200 Ecuadorian armed men, which attacked the police station at Aguas Verdes, to which the Peruvians reacted by sending an infantry company to Aguas Verdes and repulsing the Ecuadorians back across the Zaramilla. The fighting then spread to the entire border area along the Zaramilla River. By July 6, the Peruvian aviation was conducting airstrikes against the Ecuadorian border posts along the river. According to Ecuadorian Col. Luis A. Rodriguez, commander of the Ecuadorian forces defending the province of El Oro during the war, the incidents of July 5 started when an Ecuadorian border patrol found some Peruvian civilians, protected by policemen, clearing a patch of land on the Ecuadorian side of the river. Upon seeing the patrol, the Peruvian policemen opened fire, killing one soldier. This was followed by the widespread exchange of fire between troops on the opposing banks of the Zaramilla, while two Ecuadorian officers sent to Aguas Verdes to speak with the Peruvian local commanding officer were told by Peruvian authorities to go back to the lines. Regardless, a much larger and better equipped Peruvian force of 13,000 men quickly overwhelmed the approximately 1,800 Ecuadorian covering forces, driving them back from the Zaramilla and invading the Ecuadorian province of El Oro. Peru also carried out limited aerial bombing of the Ecuadorian towns of Huaquiles, Arenales, Santa Rosa, and Mashala. The Peruvian army had at its disposal a battalion of armor made up of Czech tanks, with artillery and air support. They had also established a paratroop unit in the region and used it to great effect by seizing the Ecuadorian port city of Puerto Bolivar. On July 27, 1941, marking the first time in the Americas that airborne troops were used in combat, faced with a delicate political situation that even prompted Ecuadorian President Carlos Alberto Arroyo del Rio to keep a sizable part of the army in the capital, Quito. Ecuador promptly requested a ceasefire, which went into effect on July 31, 1941. Yet, Ecuador still carried out guerrilla attacks upon the Peruvian troops. As a result of the war, Peru occupied almost the entire Ecuadorian coastal province of El Oro and some towns of the Andean province of Loja. Besides driving the Ecuadorians back along the whole line of dispute along the Amazonian border, Ecuador's government, led by Dr. Carlos Alberto Arroyo del Rio, signed the Protocol tricolor de Rio de Janeiro on January 29, 1942, and Peruvian forces subsequently withdrew. Nonetheless, during the retreat several attacks were made against the Peruvian military, and a series of lives were lost during the process. Aftermath. The placement of the border markers along the definitive border line indicated by the Rio Protocol was not concluded when the Ecuadorians withdrew for the demarcation commissions in 1948, arguing inconsistencies between the geographical realities on the ground and the instructions of the protocol, a situation that, according to Ecuador, made it impossible to implement the protocol until Peru agreed to negotiate a proper line in the affected area. Thus, some 78 kilometers of the Ecuadorian-Peruvian border were left unmarked for the next 50 years, causing continuous diplomatic and military crisis between the two countries. In 1960, Ecuadorian President José María Velasco declared that the Rio Protocol was void. According to the Velasco administration, the treaty, having been signed under Peruvian military occupation of Ecuadorian soil, was illegal and contrary to Pan-American treaties that outlawed any treaty signed under the threat of force. However, this proclamation made little international impact. Peruvian analysts have speculated that President Velasco used the nullity thesis in order to gather political support with a nationalistic and populist rhetoric. In 1981, both countries again clashed briefly in the Populist War. Only in the aftermath of the Cenipa War of 1995 was the dispute finally settled. On October 26, 1998, representatives of Peru and Ecuador signed a definitive peace agreement. Notable combatants: Lieutenant José A. Quinones was a Peruvian pilot during the war. On July 23, 1941, his plane, a North American R-50 fighter, was shot down while carrying out a low-level attack on an Ecuadorian border post on the banks of the Zaramilla River. According to traditional Peruvian accounts, Quinones, upon being hit by ground fire, crashed his damaged aircraft deliberately into the Ecuadorian anti-aircraft position, destroying it. He was promoted posthumously to captain, and is today considered a national hero of Peru. Ecuadorian wartime records of the downing differ greatly from Peruvian ones, as Ecuador did not have any anti-aircraft guns located in the area, and the limited artillery located at the Mashula was, due to a mistake by the Minister of Defense, useless, as he ordered the wrong caliber of ammunition to be delivered to the units.